In the shadowed parlours of Victorian London, a woman lay upon a physician's table, her breath unsteady, her heart a captive of unspoken desires. Her ailment? Hysteria, a diagnosis as vague as it was damning, born from an ancient myth of a restless womb. Yet the remedy prescribed was no tonic or tincture, but an act so intimate it defies modern comprehension. A doctor's hands, deft and clinical, coaxing her to a shuddering release termed hysterical paroxysm. This was no clandestine affair, but standard practice in the finest clinics of Europe and America, performed by men of science who saw no sin in their work. Beneath the veneer of respectability lay a truth so shocking it borders on farce, a truth of medical ignorance and cultural denial that birthed the vibrator. A story long buried now demands its telling. For more dark corners of history, subscribe and share thoughts below. In the dim annals of ancient Egypt, a peculiar notion took root. A woman's womb, untamed by motherhood, could wander her body like a restless spectre, sowing chaos in its wake. By the time of Hippocrates, this phantom organ had a name, hystera, the Greek word for uterus, and a legacy that would haunt medicine for millennia. Plato, with poetic fervor, declared it an animal within an animal, a feral force yearning for children, pressing against lungs and heart to provoke fainting spells, anxiety or fits of despair. The cure? Marriage and procreation, to tether the errant womb to its purpose. This was no mere superstition, it was doctrine, etched into the minds of physicians who saw women as vessels of fragility, their bodies governed by a capricious organ. By the Renaissance, the wandering womb was dismissed as fanciful, yet the diagnosis of hysteria endured, a shapeless malady that ensnared any woman who dared deviate from serenity. A furrowed brow, a sleepless night, a spark of defiance, all were branded symptoms of this nebulous affliction. Thomas Sydenham, a luminary of 17th century medicine, proclaimed hysteria the most common ailment after fever, afflicting a quarter of all women. In the Victorian age, this belief calcified into dogma. Women, deemed delicate by nature, were thought to be ruled by their reproductive systems, their minds and bodies frail under the weight of their biology. A woman who wept too freely, spoke too boldly, or languished in discontent was not merely human. She was hysterical, her very existence a medical conundrum. This was no innocent error. The diagnosis became a cage, a tool to silence and subdue. Any behavior, be it passionate or reserved, rebellious or meek, could be labeled as sickness. Victorian physicians, cloaked in the authority of science, saw women as creatures of instinct, their emotions a tangle of nerves and hormones. William Acton, a titan of medical thought, declared in 1857 that respectable women were untroubled by carnal desires, a claim that cast a shadow over the era's understanding of femininity. Thus, when women presented symptoms born of frustration or unvoiced longing, their pleas were met not with empathy, but with a diagnosis that stripped them of agency. The stage was set for a treatment so bizarre it would defy belief, a treatment that would reveal the depths of medicine's blindness. Yet this was merely the beginning of a darker farce. In the sterile chambers of Victorian clinics, a woman reclined upon a draped table, her modesty preserved by a thin sheet, while a physician's hands performed a ritual as routine as it was unthinkable. This was pelvic massage, the prescribed cure for hysteria, a procedure cloaked in clinical detachment, yet steeped in a scandalous intimacy. With lavender or rose-scented oils, the doctor applied measured strokes to the vulva, coaxing the patient toward what medical texts termed hysterical paroxysm, a convulsion of muscles, a flush of the skin, a flood of relief. To the physicians, this was no act of passion, but a tedious chore, akin to lancing a boil or setting a fracture. They described the outcome in sterile prose: violent contractions, copious lubrication, a return to calm. Yet what they induced, unwittingly, was the very climax their culture denied women could feel. This was no fringe practice. By the late 19th century, hysteria was deemed an epidemic, with physicians estimating that 3/4 of American women suffered its nebulous grip. In cities like London and New York, clinics burgeoned, dedicated solely to this peculiar therapy. Dr. Taylor's practice in Manhattan became a beacon for the afflicted, its appointment books swollen with women seeking weekly, sometimes daily, sessions. Some endured this ritual for decades, their lives punctuated by these clandestine reprieves. The scale was staggering. Millions of women, from the working class to the aristocracy, submitted to the hands of doctors who saw only disease where desire simmered unspoken. Beyond the physician's office, the treatment took on even stranger forms. In opulent spas of Bath and Baden-Baden, women perched on chairs with cut-out seats, subjected to the relentless force of high-pressure water jets aimed at their most private regions. Dubbed the pelvic shower by the French, these hydrotherapy sessions promised to restore feminine vitality through the scientific application of thermal waters. Wealthy matrons cloaked in propriety flocked to these resorts, emerging invigorated from treatments that echoed the forbidden. For those of means, physicians made house calls, their black bags concealing the tools of this bizarre trade. The hysteria industry, veiled in medical legitimacy, thrived on a scale that rivaled any hospital's commerce, its practitioners blind to the truth beneath their fingertips. Yet this was but a prelude to an invention that would transform this dark art forever. In the gaslit offices of the 1880s, Dr. Joseph Mortimer Granville faced a peculiar plight. His hands, wearied from hours of laborious pelvic massage, cramped under the strain of treating hysteria's endless sufferers. His solution was a stroke of unwitting genius, a mechanical device pulsing with electric vigor that could induce the elusive hysterical paroxysm in mere minutes. Thus, the vibrator was born, not as a tool of pleasure, but as a clinical instrument, its rapid oscillations heralded as a triumph of medical efficiency. Granville, ever the purist, insisted his percussor was for male muscle ailments, yet his peers seized upon it with fervor, wielding it to relieve the female complaint that plagued their appointment books. By the dawn of the 20th century, vibrators proliferated, their whirring presence as commonplace in doctors' cabinets as the stethoscope. The market for these devices exploded with a fervor that belied their grim purpose. Medical journals brimmed with advertisements boasting models like the Chattanooga vibrator, which promised to quell hysteria's symptoms in under 10 minutes. By 1900, vibrators ranked among the most ubiquitous household appliances in America, nestled in catalogs beside toasters and sewing machines. A 1908 Sears advertisement touted a home model as most satisfactory for domestic service, its language cloaked in euphemism, yet startlingly explicit. "Vibration is life," one advert proclaimed, as if the device channeled some primal force. Yet the physicians who wielded these machines remained steadfastly oblivious, their minds shackled by a culture that erased female desire from existence. Medical texts, silent on the clitoris, save as a vestigial curiosity, offered no hint that the paroxysms they induced were the very climaxes their society deemed impossible. This ignorance was no mere oversight, it was a chasm of willful denial. Dr. John Harvey Kellogg, famed for his cereals, operated a sanitarium where vibrators treated hysteria while he decried masturbation as a moral scourge, never connecting the two. Women, however, whispered truths their doctors could not grasp. Diary entries from the era betray their secret delight. One wrote in 1892 of her weekly restoration, under Dr. Harrison's care, her words trembling with unspoken anticipation. Networks of women shared physicians' names, their clandestine visits a rebellion against a world that stifled their voices. Yet this era of mechanical marvels bore a darker edge. Some doctors, like Isaac Baker Brown, mutilated women with clitoridectomies to cure perceived deviancy, their scalpels carving a brutal testament to medicine's blindness. The vibrator, a beacon of relief for some, stood atop a foundation of ignorance and harm, a foundation that would soon crumble under the weight of an undeniable truth. As the 20th century dawned, a seismic shift stirred beneath the sterile veneer of Victorian medicine. Sigmund Freud, flawed yet perceptive, dared to suggest that hysteria stemmed not from a wayward womb, but from the psyche's unspoken desires, planting the seeds of doubt in a crumbling edifice. Yet it was not science that toppled the hysteria industry, but the flickering shadows of early stag films. In the 1920s, these illicit reels laid bare the vibrator's true purpose, their brazen depictions shattering the illusion of clinical propriety. Overnight, the device vanished from doctors' cabinets and respectable catalogues, its whirring legacy consigned to whispers and taboo. By 1952, hysteria was struck from medical texts, its diagnosis a relic of a bygone era. Yet its ghost lingered, a spectre that branded women's pain as mere emotion, their voices dismissed as echoes of a fabricated malady. The numbers defy comprehension. Over 7 decades, millions of women, from London's drawing rooms to New York's clinics, sought relief in a ritual that delivered what their society forbade. Tens of millions of hysterical paroxysms, climaxes by another name, were administered by physicians who saw only symptoms where passion burned. This was no mere quirk of history, but a testament to the power of cultural blindness to warp even the most learned minds. Victorian doctors, armed with the finest education, stood at the precipice of truth, yet saw nothing, their hands unwitting instruments of liberation in a world that shackled desire. Rachel Maines, a scholar of this strange chapter, noted the bitter irony. These physicians provided the sole outlet for women's pleasure, while believing they treated a disease born of its absence. The legacy of hysteria is a cautionary tale, a mirror held to medicine's fallibility and society's capacity to deny the obvious. It whispers of a time when women's bodies were mysteries to be solved by scalpel or machine, their truths buried beneath layers of propriety. Today, the term hysteria remains a slur, a shadow cast over those who dare speak their pain. For those who marvel at this dark comedy of errors, consider sharing thoughts below and subscribing for more tales from history's shadowed corners. The past, with its absurdities and cruelties, lingers as a warning. Ignorance, cloaked in authority, can blind even the wisest to the truths that pulse beneath the surface.